Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. Welcome to my sewing room. By the end of this video, you will know how to make an economy quilt block using an AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine. Now, if you stumbled across this video and are thinking, I don't have an AccuQuilt, I just want to learn how to make an economy quilt block, check out this video linked above because that will teach you how to do it using a normal rotary cutter. So now, are you with me, AccuQuilt users? Let's learn how to make an economy quilt block. First off, let's cover the dies you will need for your AccuQuilt cutting machine. I am really pleased to say that you can make an economy quilt block using dies that come in a mix and match cube. When I first bought my AccuQuilt Go, it came with the 8-inch mix and match cube, and since then I have loved using it so much. I've also accumulated a couple other sizes as well, and my goal is to get all of the sizes because I think they're all wonderful. So regardless of which cube you have, you can make the economy quilt block. I'm going to use the 12-inch cube. You'll see here, this is what one of the boxes looks like, and it includes the 3 dies that we will need. So we'll cover the dies that we need, how many layers to cut of each fabric, how many fabrics you need, all of that. But before we get too far along, I want to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit the little red subscribe button right below if you want more quilting tips, tricks, techniques, especially if you love AccuQuilt. So let's dive in. I have here 3 fabrics chosen for the economy quilt block. I'm going to do the center square white, the inner triangles, this nice little seafoam green, and then the outer triangles, the slightly darker teal color. These are all Riley Blake solids, and they're really wonderful to work with. And I need to get them ready for the AccuQuilt machine. So the first thing that I'm going to do is starch my fabric. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I love spray starch. I use Best Press in a spray bottle with my nice hot iron. Using spray starch on your fabrics before cutting allows them to shrink if they're going to shrink a little bit with the heat, and it also makes them nice and crisp so that when you're sewing they don't stretch. Now that we have our fabrics prepared, I'm going to cover which dies we need. The economy quilt block consists of 3 main shapes: the center square, which is half the size of your finished block, and then you'll need 4 quarter square triangles that go around that center square, and then you'll also need 4 half square triangles that go around the square in the square. The really wonderful thing about AccuQuilt is that the cube has all 3 of those shapes in the correct sizes. So you'll need die number 1 for the center square, die number 4 for the quarter square triangles, and die number 3 for the half square triangles. First off, grab die number 1 from your cube and place it down ready to go through the machine. We're going to cut out just 1 layer for our center square, and this one I'm going to make my center square white. So I'll go ahead and just lay 1 layer of fabric down and place the cutting mat on top and then run it through the machine. When it comes out the other end, press down and slide your cutting mat off, and you'll have your perfect square cut for the center of your economy quilt block. Next, we will cut 4 quarter square triangles. So this is die number 4. And again, because there's 4 pieces on each die, we'll only need to cut 1 layer of our fabric. So go ahead and lay your fabric down on top of your die. Check to make sure that it looks straight on grain. And then of course, put your cutting mat on top and feed it through the machine. When you're done, you will have 4 perfectly cut quarter square triangles. Next up, grab die number 3 from your cube. This is a half square triangle block that cuts 2 per pass. So go ahead and grab your fabric, and I'm actually going to keep mine folded so we have 2 layers of fabric. We're going to cut out 4 half square triangles. When it's done, go ahead and trim off the excess, and you'll now have 4 half square triangles for your outer triangles. And just like that, we are done cutting for our Economy quilt block. You can go ahead and now lay out your pieces so that you can see what your block will look like when it is finished. And since I'm using the 12-inch cube, when this block is finished, it will also finish at 12 inches or 12.5 inches with the seam allowance. Now we're going to talk about sewing our Economy quilt block together. So first off, you can go ahead and take your half square triangles and put those to the side because we don't need them quite yet. We're going to focus on the center square. The first 2 seams you will sew are 2 that are opposite of each other. So we'll also take away these and put those to the side. So now we just have our center square and 2 quarter square triangles. Go ahead and pin them in place. The edges of your quarter square triangle should match up exactly with the edges of the square. And now we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both of these and press those seams open. Now that we are at our sewing machine, we are ready to sew, and I'm going to give you a couple tips and tricks for sewing these Economy quilt blocks. First off, I have 50 weight cotton thread in both the bobbin and the upper thread, and I have my 1/4 inch pressure foot on my machine. And before I do anything, I'm going to stitch on a leader. Stitching on a leader before you start sewing on your actual pieces keeps them from getting eaten by the machine. Once you've sewn on the leader, you're ready to actually start stitching on your piece. While you're sewing, you will definitely need a couple leaders and enders, so go ahead and grab some scraps of fabric if you don't already have leaders and enders at your sewing machine for you. Some more tips in case your sewing machine is having some issues with sewing the pieces together. First off, make sure that you're using a nice sharp new sewing machine needle on your machine. Oftentimes it can be a little tempting to wait until it breaks to actually change it, but you should definitely change it out more often than that. And then another thing, if your machine offers a straight stitch plate option, you might consider using it since you're piecing on this block and then switching out to your zigzag plate when you need it. You can also stop in between pieces and stitch on a leader and then trim your threads. When you're done, go ahead and switch and stitch on the ender again. Now that those 2 seams are pressed, we'll also go ahead and pin our remaining 2 1/4 square triangles onto our piece, making a square and a square block. So for here, I'm actually going to pin it with the back of the block up, and I'm going to match up the corner of that seam allowance with the corner of the new piece that I'm going to do. And that's how you can make sure that it is centered. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side of the square. Now we stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both of those pieces. Now that these 2 seams are sewn, when you press them, you should have a 1/4 inch of seam allowance at all 4 corners of your center square. We're going to go ahead and press these seams open. It helps if you do a nice little finger press before pressing with the iron. Now that your square and a square is complete, we're going to add our remaining 4 half square triangles in the same fashion that we had just added the 1/4 square triangles. So go ahead and just pick 2 sides and start there. And this time we're going to line up a couple different places. We will have a little tiny corner of the half square triangle hanging off on each end, and that's how you can make sure that it's centered. It'll just be a little tiny corner. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin in the center and then also pin at each end. And just like we did the first time around, we're gonna do the two opposite sides of the square at a time. And now we're ready to sew. As you're stitching your half square triangles onto your square in a square block, there's one way to make sure that you get perfect points, and that is as you're sewing, be sure to try to hit right at the little corner of your inner square on all four sides. So now when we pull the seam allowance open, that point is not lost in the seam allowance and it is just perfectly matched. The next step, you guessed it, is to press the seams open. Now our economy quilt block is almost finished. We just have two more half square triangles to sew on to finish it up, and we're going to do it the same way that we just sewed the other two. So we're gonna go ahead and flip it over and match it up. The edges of your half square triangle should perfectly match up with the edges of the block that you're working on. You'll see on this piece another example of how you stitch right up to that corner of your inner block. Flip it over and then check to make sure that your corners are nice and clean, and then press these final seams open. Once your seams are pressed open, I like to also flip it back over and give the whole block a good press. Once your block is pressed flat, you are good to go. There's no trimming needed, which is one of my favorite things about using the AccuQuilt to make an economy quilt block. I hope you enjoyed this quilting tutorial and maybe even learned something new. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and of course check out homemadeemilyjane.com for lots more quilting tips and tutorials. I will also post in the description below a link to a blog post all about the economy quilt block.